I first became fascinated with the way that people perceived the built environment and how the built environment affected people's psyche, in the sense that you put someone in to a large open space that's used to living in a city that's overcrowded, built up, and suddenly they feel agoraphobic. And similarly, you take somebody from a larger city, put them into a smaller setting, and they feel claustrophobic. So this is where the space between kind of germinated from. And with my work, it started off as kind of architectural, and then putting people into those places, and looking at how they move, interact. And this kind of got me thinking of the way that our well-being and psyche is affected by this kind of placement of buildings, but also kind of how we ourselves tend to fill voids. It's almost the human nature, as it were, and also kind of how we interact with each other. This kind of idea of personal space started creeping into my work quite early on, looking at form, but not only of form of people, but also how buildings interact with each other, and how that kind of links in with our own psyche. We build buildings and we position them in such a way. The Japanese have a word for it. They call it ma. This void, this space between, and that's really kind of where I started off looking at this project and the various angles, and it ballooned out of all proportion. I've had to narrow it down over time. Along came COVID-19, and the way that we interact with each other and our space was kind of dictated by this pandemic, and certainly the way that I approached my project had to change. So as part of this, sort of reassessing, this sort of idea of isolation, being forced into isolation and separated from the people that we would normally see on a day-to-day basis, having to conduct Zoom meetings, and it was quite a challenge mentally to readjust. And as part of this, I started looking at how I interact with my space, and this kind of forced isolation, being separated from my children, and how that's really affected me. And it's kind of been quite useful to look at other people's work, certainly photographers that work with self-portraiture. So I've looked at people like Sharon Covert, who looks at emotional states of being, and uses self-portraiture to illustrate that, and more of a performance-based photographers, Claire Ray, where she positions herself in these quite unusual settings, and it's quite powerful. So I've been looking at this. There's Kyle Thompson as well, whose work, ironically, is called Spaces Between. Again, it's very performative, and I found this is really useful to kind of look at how, while I can't work with other people because of social distancing, not being able to go into people's homes and look at their personal spaces, I've used this time to look at myself and my personal space, my journey, and really sort of engage in this performance, acting out the emotional states that I've gone through during lockdown and self-isolating, but also looking at my home and my space, what makes a personal space mine, and as theorists have written, the house is like a storehouse for memory, and how we interpret these personal spaces and store our memories within them. We create these spaces as a refuge almost, not just for ourselves physically, but also we build up memories and thoughts, and it's but they can change. The space that was home can suddenly become a prison, and I've been exploring all these the work of David Hockney and his joiner photos really rang true to me. I originally studied as a ceramicist, and sculpture of ceramics was a big thing for me. And I saw these joiner images as a way of bringing in almost a sculptural element into the photography. And I've been experimenting with this mainly as a way of refining those personal space images and the emotion in it, but also ways to engage viewers, really bringing them in to look at the image. And the concept is that once these are printed up, looking at large format, the idea is then that you're playing around with this idea of proxemics, a personal space, so the viewer is having to move in and out of the space. They're looking around the photo, they're moving out of their comfort zone towards the image, which is quite large, looking at the fine details that are within it. And it's this kind of idea of engaging a viewer, moving around the space that you're creating. So what I'm aiming to do further on is work with other people, look at their personal spaces and image those into these large format pictures that will be the viewer then interact with. So thanks for listening.